So I've been doing this podcast for just over 3 years and I really want to bring it live for you all. So I'm going to need a favor from you. If you're interested in seeing the Savvy Wallet podcast live, please register your interest by signing up to my mailing list with the link in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for your support so far.
I don't think our relationship with money is only shaped by the money lessons that we learn from our parents at home, what they told us, or maybe what we watched them do. I think it's also influenced by our personality. Do we see ourselves as being worthy of good things, or are we very insecure and we don't feel deserving of good things and we keep self-sabotaging financially?
But why do we have then such emotions for money though? Why do we associate so much to this thing that is paper, nowadays digital?
Because it's a symbol and we attach things to symbols. And if you take money as a symbol, then it can stand for all sorts of different things. And some people see it as a symbol of power, credibility, of success. Some people see it as a symbol of greed and corruption. And so what we each think it represents is different. And I think that's what feeds into why it's still such a taboo. We're approaching the Christmas season. We need to be mindful of how we give gifts and what gifts we buy, because gifts can be controlling in some way.
You're not defined by where you come from.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big message that I always want to tell people.
Like you have to be able to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
When you grow up in ends, you don't realize it when you're confident, but you have an audacity to do things that ordinarily most people wouldn't be willing to do.
Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Atto. We have a special guest in the building. We have Vicky, who has been a psychotherapist for over 10 years. She has a psychology degree. She has a psychotherapy postgraduate degree and MBA. You also have a 4-year postgraduate specialization in psychodynamic psychotherapy at WPF therapy, right? Is that correct? Yeah. Wow. You've done a lot of studying, Vicky. You've done a lot of study. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think it's going to be an important conversation. But actually, before I get started, I want to actually say something. So we're going to be gifting 2 people, copies of Vicky's book. So all you have to do to be in with a chance is just say your favorite moment of the podcast, and do not say within the first 5 minutes because I'm not going to enter you in. So yeah, cool. All right. So obviously, I described you, but who would you say Vicky is?
Well, my professional self is a financial psychotherapist. It's the specialization that I've developed more recently, but I tend to work more broadly as a psychotherapist with people. So sometimes people come to me presenting problem related to money and they end up staying for anything else. Okay. But oftentimes, I would say probably 90% of the clients that I see come with a money-related difficulty. So I help people better understand their relationship with money when they're getting stuck in kind of behaviors that they don't quite understand or they can't move away from. And that's what I do most of my time. But last year I had the big project of writing the book as well. But mostly I practice as a psychotherapist.
Wow. That's interesting that you said 90% of people come to you for money, because what I found very interesting, especially as, going through the book, was the fact that you said that during your studies that, money wasn't a topic that came up, and yet you are getting 90% of your clients come to you about money issues, which makes sense, to be fair, because where else could they go? Essentially.
And I think they come to me with money issues because I started calling myself a financial psychotherapist. It's kind of a term that I made up in response to seeing how many people were struggling psychologically with money issues. And I wanted to give them a space to bring those problems, those difficulties. And what ended up happening is that a lot of the people that were writing to me looking for therapy, they were saying in their initial email that I didn't know I could talk to a therapist about this, and actually it does feel like an emotional problem more than an issue that I need practical advice on. Yeah. And so it kind of gave a lot of people a space that maybe wasn't there before. But you're right, in the psychology degree, we didn't really focus on money as a topic. We focused a lot of, food, maybe eating disorders, or people's relationship with sex, people's relationship with others, but, all sorts of different things. But money wasn't a huge topic. We talked about it in terms of the fees. How do we set the fee for therapy, and what happens? How do clients respond to that? But yeah, money's part of living a life. So we all have a relationship with it. We deal with it in the day-to-day. We save, we spend, we earn. And so we'll all inevitably have a different relationship with it because we're all different.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much for explaining that. So I've reworded this question, right? Because I like to always think of more innovative ways to ask people questions, right? So, take us through the backstory of Vicky and how you became the person that is sitting in front of us today.
Nice question.
Thank you.
The backstory, well, first of all, let me say that as a psychotherapist, I don't say a lot about myself and my backstory. And there's a reason for that. Yeah. When somebody comes in the room to see a therapist, they want to understand themselves and they want to be understood. Yeah. And for me to do that at my best, then I shouldn't be taking up much space in the room. That's one reason. It leaves the other person the freedom to talk about themselves without judgment. So you can imagine, if you knew that I had children or I didn't have children, that would influence how you might talk about your fears of having children, for example, right? So the less I say about myself, the better it is for the clients. However, as I was writing the book, I felt that I needed to explain my passion for this topic, at least a bit. And there I did disclose that my family had a very complicated relationship with money that led me to bring it to my own personal therapy. So when I went to my therapist and I was trying to make sense of everything that happened and what it meant to everyone, I really understood a lot. I understood that, a lot of what I was struggling with wasn't about the money, but it was about what the money represented, what it meant to us. And it meant something different to different people in the family. And kind of unpacking all those nuances was really helpful to me. And it helped me determine what I did next with my own, expectations around success, around earning, all the different choices, money choices that I made. So that was a big part of the journey and a big part of why I'm passionate about this. Yeah. And I think everyone should be talking more about money. Yeah. And of course, then there's the professional reason, which is that, I noticed that as therapists, we had the tools to think about money and we weren't applying them. But then I also had an MBA degree, which made me maybe a bit more comfortable than therapists to have money talked about in the room. So, when people were talking about, negotiating shares in a company or going through a bankruptcy process, I didn't kind of shy away from going into the details of those conversations. Yeah. And so that, I think, created a space that maybe made it a bit more comfortable for me and for the client to be bringing therapy in the room.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say that that comfortability with money, because I think that if we don't study money or if we don't study it and understand it, I think we're not comfortable talking about it.
Yes.
In a way, I think that's what happens.
That's what happens. There's a lot of shame around it. Most people I talk to, not just in the therapy room, but even in conversations outside, a lot of the population carries a sense that they should know more than they do about money. Even, very successful people have insecurities when it comes to managing their finances. And I've heard them say, but at work I'm great, but then with my personal finances, I'm a mess. And, there's all sorts of inconsistencies and insecurities. And I think it does come down to the fact that we're all kind of suffering in silence with our little money shame and money anxieties. And the less we talk about it, the more that continues to be a problem, because it doesn't become normal that, we all have our own preoccupations when it comes to money.
Yeah, amazing. So I think this is starting to become more common knowledge, right? There's research that suggests, right, in terms of money habits, it's formed at the age of 7, right? Which is interesting. So I guess, how does our relationship with money, how's that developed in a way?
I think that's a very specific number, and I don't know if I would necessarily agree with it. I think that our relationship with money continues to change after 7, and some of it might be established even before then, because I don't think our relationship with money is only shaped by the money lessons that we learn from our parents at home, what they told us or maybe what we watched them do. I think it's also influenced by our personality. What do we think about ourselves? Do we see ourselves as being worthy of good things? And so we go out there in the world and we make money and we feel confident about deserving it. We feel confident asking for a raise because we're worth it. Or are we very insecure and we don't feel deserving of good things, and we keep self-sabotaging financially because there's a little part of us that thinks that we're not deserving of good things? That's one example. But if you take even, what we learn about relationships, and we learn about relationships watching our parents relate to one another and watching our parents relate to us, that sets up a whole set of expectations about how the world will respond to us, what is it like to be in a relationship. And when you take money into the picture, then sometimes we use it to act out some of the emotions that we expect to find in relationships. Yeah. So if you go through life building relationships in which you're expecting to be rejected or abandoned, then you might use money to maybe lure people closer to you. Maybe you become really generous with them because you're a people pleaser. That's the only way in which people will stick around, is if you give them more than you receive. And so you see how suddenly you can explain a money behavior like generosity through a lens of what you learned about relationships. Yeah. And we learn about relationships, throughout our lives. It doesn't happen before 7 or after 7. I think it's an evolution. And I've seen people in the therapy room who struggle with a money-related issue, let's say overspending, spending on fancy clothes and having too many of them, that might have its roots in having been bullied in school. That they felt really left out and marginalized and they couldn't fit in. And so that created this need in them, this kind of emotional imprint that it is important to go through life trying to fit in. Yeah. And so what they do is they spend clothes hoping that will be, the outfit that will make them feel like they belong in their group of friends or with their colleagues. So it's a long answer, but I think it's because it's a lifetime of experiences that shapes what we do with money.
Yeah. It's so interesting, and I love the fact that you explained that, because I think and the reason why I asked you that question was I was deliberate in asking that question, because on the podcast what I like to do is I like to challenge our perception of ideas that we have, like such as that, which is your money habit is set by the age of 7. And I appreciate that. You're absolutely right. Your habits can be formed because of not money. Maybe, like you say, maybe you're stingy not because your parents were stingy. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that's why you're stingy. It's like you say, it could be for other reasons. But why do we have then such emotions for money though? Where does that come from? Why does that happen to us? Why do we associate so much to this thing that is paper, nowadays digital?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because it's a symbol, and we attach things to symbols. And what a symbol means there's some universal meaning. So, if we all look at a flag of a country, we all understand that it can represent something, it represents the country. But then what that evokes in us and what it represents for each of us could be slightly different. And for some people, it could be, a sense of pride. For other people, it can bring up nostalgic feelings. For other people, it can represent something very different. And so if you take money as a symbol, then it can stand for all sorts of different things. And some people see it as a symbol of power, of credibility, of success. Some people see it as a symbol of greed and corruption. And so what we each think it represents is different. And I think that's what feeds into why it's still such a taboo, because we don't know what's going on in the other person's mind. We don't know what they're thinking about money. And so not knowing what the other person's parameter is around what's too much, what's too little, what's greedy, what's generous, what's frugal, always leaves us in this place of, it's better not to say anything, because then, I might be left feeling ashamed about what I said or feeling judged. Yeah. So I think it's what we put on it, what we project on money, that makes it such a powerful object.
Yeah. I don't want to label this in my next question, because I'm going to do this, right? Because I want to be careful in terms of like how I ask this. So healthy relationship with money. Is there such a thing as a healthy relationship with money? And if there is, what could that look like? Because I don't want to just say blanket, these are just the only things. And if somebody doesn't have it, it means that they're not healthy. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just trying to give people an idea of what that could potentially look like.
Well, I like using the term financial well-being because in a way, so to define it, it's having a happy relationship with money. And by happy, I mean feeling in control of the choices you make about money, feeling a certain degree of kind of satisfaction about your financial situation, but also a degree of control over it and over the choices that you make. It's broad, but if you think about it, I mean, you can see that an unhealthy relationship comes when, we're not happy about our situation. For example, we don't have enough financial resilience, so we don't have enough money to meet unexpected needs or even to meet our basic needs. Or when we don't feel in control. And that could be because sometimes there are things that are outside of our control that are having an impact on us. We also saw the cost of living crisis, wars, all sorts of things that impact the recessions, things that impact the economy. They will make us nervous and not feel in control of our financial situation or threaten that sense of control. So I think it's, and sometimes it's habits or even addictions that make us feel out of control. So if you have a gambling addiction or a spending addiction, you won't feel in control of your choices. So I think that those are the two key things. And so I think there are people that have a good enough level of financial well-being. They're okay with how much they have. They're not focusing on what they don't have all the time, and they manage to have a good balance between enjoying their money, saving some for the future and for a rainy day, and investing some for the future.
You know what I really liked, actually? The fact that you said it's choices. And I know in your book, when you talked about financial well-being, one of the factors in there was financial literacy, which we all lack. We all lack financial literacy. So I think no wonder all of us probably at a time didn't feel like we were in control of our money because we didn't have the knowledge, right?
Yeah. One of the statistics I like the most in there is the one. It's one piece of research that showed that, first of all, half the population across countries in Europe and even globally is anxious about money. But the one thing that decreases, research has shown, the financial anxiety is literacy. So the more you know, the less anxious you feel about money. So we have, the information is out there. We just need to build into our culture learning about money like we learn about other things in schools. Why aren't we learning about the difference between, a current account and a savings account? Why aren't we learning about debt and taxes? I'm not suggesting teaching all these things in year one, but age appropriately, they should be built into the curriculum so that we come out of school not feeling so frightened and ashamed.
It's very important. I think it's very, very important. The fact, like you say, it's linked to your financial well-being. And I think if I use myself, I definitely will feel that I'm a lot more. I mean, I'm talking about money, so clearly I'm okay talking about money, and I think I'm okay talking about money because I'm not going to say I understand every aspect, but I have a good level of understanding of it. I'm continually trying to educate myself. And so therefore I understand how it kind of works at a high level. So therefore, if certain situations happen, I kind of understand why, right? I'm very conscious of that. I wanted to understand, right? So talking about, let's say, positive financial well-being, how does that impact one person? What's the impact of, being healthy from a financial well-being point of view?
I think it impacts well-being overall. And the opposite is also true, that the lack of financial well-being can be, mildly anxiety-provoking, or it can bring people to really, really dark places. I mean, the statistics around debt and suicide are terrible. Financial instability can really go to the core of our sense of security as human beings. I mean, it wakes up something really, primitive, a sense of survival. So I think the more we learn about it, the more we teach children about it, I think the better we're setting them up to be kind of mentally healthy individuals, not just when it comes to money.
Yeah. And how can people figure out how they feel towards money? Because I'm sure a lot of people watching and listening to this want to understand, okay, so how can I recognize, how it makes me feel in different types of situations, or maybe not even feel all the time, because it might not just be the money, but that maybe that triggers you to go and do something with money as well. How can people identify that?
Well, I think there's different signs to look out for when, if you want to spot that you don't have good financial well-being. Your feelings can be a good clue. So if every time you spend money, you feel guilty, well, then you need to ask yourself, why is that? Where's this feeling coming from? Or if you always, end up tipping too much or bringing too many presents and then you regret it, you feel resentful about it, and then that begs the question, well, why are you doing it? What are you trying to do there with the money? So I think feelings can be a good clue. Then there's facts. If you have credit card debt, then, clearly you're spending beyond your means. Why is that happening? Is it out of need, or is it that you tend to overspend when you're feeling bored or lonely or nervous or whatever it is? And, people overspend for all sorts of reasons. And so if you're trying to kind of dig into that, you can ask yourself questions and, play detective a bit around, what's the pattern? Do I tend to overspend when I'm out with friends? And if so, am I trying to impress them? Is that what's going on? Or am I overspending on Sunday afternoons? And that's actually when I feel most lonely and I start to feel a bit depressed. And so you can kind of spot patterns or even spot inconsistencies. Why do I always blurt out my bonus when I'm with one group of people and not generally with others? What's going on there in those relationships? So I think there's a lot that can alert us. And sometimes we hear the feedback from people. We don't really kind of take it in, but somebody might have called you a bit stingy or too frugal sometimes, and we ignore it. But then we start noticing that actually, we're always the one wanting to share the bill in every detail when it comes at the restaurant, and so you can see yourself kind of through other people's eyes as well, through their feedback, and all of these things can make you at least curious about why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah. Is there anything that people can do to, I guess, let's say, let me use an example. Let's say people, and we're going to talk a bit more about overspending, but let's say someone feels like, you know what, I'm spending way beyond my means, where like I'm having to take loans to survive, which is obviously not a great situation to be in, and that's consistently something that they're doing, month from month. What can that person kind of do to, I guess, get out of that cycle or start developing, I guess, more healthy, financial well-being and healthier habits as well?
And are you talking about somebody who has no choice but to kind of get into debt because they're really...
Let me rephrase my question. Sorry. They have a choice, but they put themselves... Somebody that doesn't have a choice has different, I guess, almost a vulnerable person in that way. But this person has, but they do put themselves in that position, which I know many people do that. So
and to go back to the first point, we live in a country that is a developed country, supposedly a rich country, but 20% of the population still lives below the poverty line, and so I get asked a lot. Well, what if that's where you are? I would say there's still, even in those cases where it might seem like a luxury to be thinking about emotions around money, I think there's still a lot that we can do to work on how it affects us, to what degree it affects us, because, and I know I'm kind of diverging a bit, but it feels like an important point, because there are a lot of people that struggle in a very real way with money and enter a cycle in which they feel kind of more and more helpless, and there I think trying to focus on what you have control over, the bits that you can tweak and change here and there that make you feel like you have a bit more of a sense of agency, that it's not all crumbling on you, I think can be helpful. But you asked me a different question. When we are self-sabotaging, essentially, going in debt when we don't really, when we do have a choice, again, I would invite people to ask themselves, why am I doing this? What's the overspending about? Am I trying to fit in? Or is it a part of me that kind of can control my impulses? I'm kind of constantly, rather than sitting with my feelings, I am acting on them. And you see people do that sometimes because they've watched parents do something similar, maybe not with money, but maybe they had a parent with a drinking problem or any kind of addiction. They watched anytime the parent felt anything, instead of talking about the feeling, naming it, or sitting with it, they would act. And so that's what they learned to do, feel, act, feel, spend. And that can get people very quickly into kind of a cycle of debt. Wow. And there's a mechanism as well, like a physiological reason why then it becomes addictive and you need to spend more frequently and more every time. Our brain gets a dopamine hit that then asks us to go back for more, and it creates a vicious cycle that then is hard to break for some people.
Yeah. It's retail therapy is addictive. Retail therapy is addictive. Also, I'm going to talk about myself personally here. To be fair, I used to be a spender at university. I was definitely a spender at university. And actually not just university, even like my early years after university, I did spend. I would be one of those people that will spend, not look at my bank account the next day, and have to eventually cringe and look at it like when, you can't withdraw this today. Like, oh my God, like how much did I spend that night? I was one of those people. But I do catch myself doing it sometimes. Now I'm not a crazy spender. I would say I'm much more of a saver. But what I've realized is that sometimes, let's say you've gone through a tough week, right? In terms of work, and you can get into the position where you're like, oh, I'm going to treat myself. And there's nothing wrong with treating yourself, by the way. That's completely fine. But I think when you get to the point where you're treating yourself, every little obstacle, even if the obstacle is not that big, I'm going to treat myself. And that's how you can kind of get into this whole, the retail therapy thing, right? Where I'm essentially, for having a bad week, I'm going to go shop and do all this stuff and I'm going to feel better. I find that quite interesting, actually.
Yeah, and I think the tricky bit is to catch yourself doing it. As you say, there comes a point, and people are good at kind of ignoring the part of them that knows. But you see, when they come to me, there's always a part of them that knows. And as you say, there's a part of you that knows that, oh, this is the fourth week in a row that I'm treating myself. This is going to hurt when I open my account. But you see, catching yourself having that thought is the moment in which you have a choice, in which you say, right, am I going to face what I'm doing? Or am I going to continue being in denial and pretend it's not happening? And people use denial and vagueness very often when it comes to money. So either, to give an example, they might say, oh, I know my investment situation is a mess, but I really can't deal with it. Okay, what do you mean it's a mess? Oh, I don't know. I haven't looked at it in forever. Well, okay, what would it be like to open and have a look at it? And it's incredible because we think that keeping it vague is going to make us feel better, but actually it does the exact opposite. It kind of sits there as an unknown anxiety. And when we have anxieties, we tend to catastrophize with those. So they tend to be much worse than it might actually look when you open. Yeah. But at least when you open it, even if it's worse than you imagined, you have a choice. And that's what happens with debt, which of course comes wrapped up with a lot of shame in it as well. People open it when it's too late to get the kind of help that they could have gotten much earlier in the process, and it would have been a sort of salvageable situation, but they kind of let it accumulate and build up until it's it's very difficult to restructure and deal with. Amazing.
Yeah, it's so interesting, the whole retail therapy. I've got nothing against it. People, watchers, listeners, if you, I say this more for just to be conscious of it. I think you should definitely treat yourself. I think you should be kind to yourself. I think that's very important to do it. But I think I'm very on the whole balance thing. And I think when you're excessive, either way, I think is negative. Excessive saver or excessive spender. I'm not for either side. Of course, savings is great in a way because obviously you've got a stack of money, but then also you could be extreme saver at a detriment to your livelihood. And I spoke about this on the podcast very recently, actually, where we were talking about the financially independent retire early movement. And a lot of that movement is a lot of sacrifice in your income, a lot of sacrificing now to be able to retire earlier in the future as well. That personally, I don't think I could ever do that. I think that would be very tough. There's nothing wrong with that, but there is a sacrifice with that as well,
Well, we need to be conscious of the trade-offs of what we're doing, right? And as you say, we're not going to judge people for choosing that if they are conscious of the trade-offs that that implies. And going back to your point about treating ourselves, absolutely, money's there to be enjoyed as well. If we have enough of it to be enjoyed, we should carve some of it out for enjoyment. And otherwise, what's the point, right? And it's okay to be sometimes a bit reckless within some boundaries, which sounds like a contradiction. But, if there is a difference between having fun and letting go or becoming completely irresponsible and self-sabotaging financially. Yeah. So I think it's about knowing when you're doing it and knowing that, you'll have to face consequences if you take it too far.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about you, and you mentioned it as well, people pleaser, and we spoke about it. The people pleaser thing, I find that interesting about being generous. And I feel like as a people pleaser as well, there could be a bit of guilt there if you say no for once, right? So let's talk about that, you know, if someone is a people pleaser, how the impact, I guess, with how they kind of act with money, essentially.
It's interesting because let's take, for example, somebody whose family member is always coming and asking for, you know, some small loans. Oh, can you, you know, do you mind getting this time? Oh, can you lend me £10 next time? And it's hard to say no. You know, on the one hand, the people pleaser gets some satisfaction, right, from giving the money because it is familiar. It goes in line with how they think relationships are structured, or at least with what they've known from the past. It's familiar, it's comfortable. So even if there's a part of them that doesn't like it and wishes they could say no, sometimes as human beings, we find it more difficult to move away from what's familiar, even if it's better for us, than to stick to what we know.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to change these patterns. But I think once we start seeing it for what it is, you know, once you recognize that, this is me being a pushover again and, you know, giving more than I receive. And why do I do this? Why can I be a bit braver this time and try to shift the dynamic that I always fall trap to and take a small risk and find out what happens if I say no? And actually, nothing catastrophic tends to happen. Worst case scenario, the other person is angry and disappointed. And so what? Can we not deal with a bit of anger and disappointment? Can it not be talked about? I think it's more the fear of what will happen if we stray away from what's familiar that holds us back. And so maybe facing that fear by taking small risks is worthwhile if it's going to change something that is, you know, filling you with resentment.
Yeah. I think probably if you have a great relationship with your parents, and let's say your parents are coming to you for that, I think it would be very hard for you to say no, potentially for your parents to be angry. I don't know if you want to deal with that. You're like, do I really want to deal with this? Like, it's
it's hard. But I guess, you know, what's the harm in at least saying, oof, you know, Dad, it's the fourth time you ask me, and I feel like, you know, this is going to have an impact on my chances to do blah, whatever it is, you know. I think staying silent, which is common of people pleaser, they will just, you know, hand it over and go along, is an extra layer of harm. You know, at least try to put into words the impact that it's having on you. And the best way to do that sometimes is to start with I statements. So you just talk about what you feel. So I feel, whatever it is, you know, I feel a bit sad when, and then you name whatever it is that they're doing. So when you're asking me for money or when you're overspending, you know, this applies to everything. So I feel sad, worried, resentful, whatever it is, when you ask me for money. And then you try to explain it. And that, you know, people can't disagree with your feelings. They can't be angry because you feel something. At least you got it out of your system, and that gives the other person a choice to do something differently.
Amazing. So I got this, there was a question that you had in your book, right? Where you said, one that you wanted to figure out for yourself, right? Why is it that for some people money is never enough, right? And I think a lot of people, that stuck out to me because I think a lot of people do deal with that. This whole concept of, you know, I'm currently here. If I get more money, I will be this, I'll be X, I'll be happy, I'll be whatever, insert. There's a lot of that, right? So I guess, that question for you, why is it that, you know, when people get more, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't seem to be enough.
Well, I think the the question is, how do they finish that sentence, right? And for some people, it's, if I get more money, I will finally feel secure, or I will finally feel worthy of recognition. You know, finally my dad will take me seriously. Finally, you know, my friends will envy me or respect me, or, you know, my parents will love me, whatever it is that we think money is going to get us. And as a society, we attach all sorts of ideas to what money will get us, be it power, respect, love, it doesn't matter. But I think for each person who's struggling with greed, which is that kind of insatiable desire for more, I would invite them to ask, well, what will more get you? I've seen, for example, in people who come from families that had very little, either lived in poverty or struggled, this idea that money is going to resolve all the problems. You know, finally, when there's money, nobody will fight, everybody will get along, because they saw people argue because of money. But actually, you know, a lot of money arguments aren't about money at all. And maybe, you know, that same family with money would have been arguing just the same. But there's this idea that money will make it all better. And I think that's why people get, you know, on that treadmill.
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept, and I think that you probably will find that people that get to X destination, yeah, life might change, but maybe that those feelings might not change as much as they think that they change. Another part of your book that I really liked. So you said sometimes a negative feeling is a natural response to a difficult financial choice, not a sign that you're making a bad choice. And I really like that, because I think that sometimes feeling bad about a decision around money doesn't always, like you say, it doesn't always mean that it's a bad decision that you've made, right?
Well, one example is you sign mortgage papers. Are you not going to feel scared and anxious? I think that's part of the process. You know, I think it would be crazy if you didn't. I mean, you've just made, for most people, the biggest financial decision of your life. There will be some negative feelings that come with it, alongside, hopefully, the joy and excitement. But yeah, we can't judge a decision just based on how we feel. But I think it's important to try and unpack it and understand it.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the guilt of spending, right? So let's say we've got this person now, and this is where it's interesting, overspenders, right? Let's say somebody's an overspender. They now get to a point where they are no longer overspending.
Are you talking about yourself?
Yeah, I was gonna say yes. I'm talking about myself. Yeah, let me talk about myself. Yeah. I don't mind using myself. I could be the guinea pig for the audience. So let's say, right, I've gone from a place where I've massive overspender, but I've managed to get past that, right? How can you stop yourself from feeling guilty now that you're on the other side? Because it always feels like, from one angle to the other, obviously you're overspending, you feel bad for doing that, but now you're to the side where you're conscious of it. Now you're trying to stop doing that, and now you just you're spending in a healthy way. You understand that you're spending in a healthy way, but you just can't get away from that feeling of, oh, should I really be doing this? Maybe I shouldn't.
So, yeah, there's something to explore there about the guilt. And in some cases, and I'm not saying that's your case, but it comes because we're just going with our sense of how much it's okay to spend, without having maybe run the numbers or done a budget, without really knowing. And I think that goes back to people being vague about things. But sometimes if you don't know that you can actually afford to spend, I don't know, £100 a month on entertainment and, eating out, whatever it is, then you're having to rely on your gut feeling that you should be okay if you roughly spend that amount. And that can be quite anxiety provoking. And so every time you spend, you might feel guilty because you don't know if that's actually burnt a hole in your ability to, I don't know, be resilient if your car breaks down or not. And so sometimes it can be down to that. Other times it might be because actually whether you're keeping it under control or not, there might be a part of you, I'm talking in general, that might still feel either undeserving or of good things at some level, or maybe has learned in the past that it is, it's spoiled and indulgent to buy things for yourself, and we don't do that, and that's selfish, and so maybe there's kind of beliefs that you picked up early on that are still kind of nagging at you while you're making reasonable purchases that you can afford to make, and you can afford. Yeah. So I think I would go and try to explore what could that be about? What comes to my mind when I'm feeling this guilt? When did I feel it before? Is it familiar?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Gambling. I want to talk about gambling, and I want to talk about it in various areas, because sometimes when people think about gambling, they're only thinking about, casinos, going, lottery and stuff like that, right? But gambling happens in investment world in terms of, gambling on stocks and shares, gambling on crypto, for example, right? That also happens there, right? That gambler's mindset. What is that about? Can you kind of take us behind the mindset around that, how that kind of happens to somebody, and also how can somebody kind of start to slowly kind of get themselves away from that as well?
Well, gambling can be an addiction, and there's different phases of it. We can do it for fun, and with boundaries, knowing that we're happy to, I don't know, lose £10 to a lottery ticket. There's problem gambling, and then there's kind of the very difficult addiction that people get themselves into debt for. And as you say, I love the point you made around trading and being as a form of gambling. It very much is. And in fact, there's gambling helplines that are getting more and more calls from people who feel they are addicted to trading. And if you hear how they describe their addiction, is very much like a gambling addiction of any other kind. And there's a few things to consider. One is that, a bit of risk-taking is a natural part of developing from adolescence to becoming an adult. We're more prone to make some silly choices and take some risk and test some boundaries. And in fact, you're seeing that a lot of young people are getting into crypto trading and getting really hooked in it and taking a lot of risk there. Unfortunately, often not conscious of the risks that they're taking. But then there's people, who have, or older than adolescents who continue to take massive risks in life. And this could be coming from all sorts of emotional places within them. Sometimes it's a part of them that is destructive, and it's destructive for complex and deep reasons. I'll give you an example. When you look at victims of abuse or neglect, research has shown that when you ask children how they feel about themselves in those situations, they tend to describe themselves as intrinsically evil and deserving of punishment. And so if you grow up in life thinking that, that's what you deserve, then you might go through life looking for it. And you get into all sorts of kind of self-sabotaging and self-destructive habits, gambling being one of them. So that's one example. The other issue is that for some people, something that just starts like a fun thing develops into an addiction because of the physiological process that I was describing before, very similar to what happens with a shopping addiction, you get excited, you go back for more, your body's asking you for more, and that becomes irresistible. But oftentimes it needs to hook into a part of you that is going for that. Is it an impulsive part of you? Is it a self-destructive part of you? And there's all sorts of different explanations for that.
Amazing. And what can people kind of do to kind of start taking themselves away from that mindset?
Well, a lot of times when you're trying to break an addiction, you need to be very practical in what you do. Create boundaries, obstacles. Stay away from triggers. So, don't have the apps on your phone if you know that will make it tempting to do. Don't, if at least at the beginning, if you're trying to limit how much you do it, try to put very firm boundaries around, I'm only going to trade, in the first 3 hours of the day, and then I'm not allowed to touch the app anymore, whatever it is. But I think avoiding temptations, triggers, maybe enlisting somebody else to help you make those boundaries more firm, and building thinking time into what you do. So, if you take, that you transfer from one account to the other to trade or to gamble, can you put a time lapse on that account, which banks can help you do, so that you have, you always have to wait, whatever it is, 24 hours before you can access the money. And so kind of any built-in thinking time can help you not act impulsively and then not end up regretting
That's interesting. I like the time-lapse one. That's an interesting feature. More banks should do that. Right,
and there's saving apps now that are built that into their features, and it can be really helpful for anyone who, even the people pleaser, who might end up acting impulsively and sending money to relatives and wants to, build in time to think about it, or anyone with struggling with overspending, it can be really useful.
Yeah, that impulse acting impulsively. Wow, that can happen in so many situations, whether you're stressed, whether you're angry, clearly angry, sad. Gosh, there's so many like points for you to be just tap your card on something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Honestly. Yeah. It's really tough. I just think that it's but what can you actually do about something like that?
Well, if you've made a decision to, let's say, be less impulsive, then maybe next time you have the urge, can you build that millisecond of thinking into it and say, well, okay, I'm about to do this. I'm about to be impulsive. What's going on? What is it? Okay, maybe you're angry, let's say. Well, can I just say I'm angry out loud? Can I just express the feeling instead of tapping? And sometimes it takes just that, just being conscious, naming the feeling, and trying to sit with it and see it. Sometimes they say to children, watch your feelings kind of pass like a cloud over you. And then the urge might go away. You don't need to act anymore because you've just sat with your feelings, something that not many of us are taught to do.
Definitely. So, okay, I wanted to talk about couples and money, right? So how does tension between couples and money happen?
Well, it can happen because of differences. And then it can happen because of things that have nothing to do with money. Sometimes people use money as a language in a way to express other things. So it can be, actually I'm angry because you haven't been around enough, and that's why I'm spending on your credit card. I am sad because you haven't been unaffectionate, and that's why I'm, dealing with my sadness through whatever it is, spending or keeping a secret from you. Financial secrets are really common, much more common than we'd imagine in couples. And so there are all ways in which we act out feelings that have to do more with a relationship than with money, but we do it through money. But I would say the major reason is because we disagree. You know, we have different views on how we should spend, what's too much, what's too little. And so we fight about it. And when we fight, what ends up happening for many is that they keep getting stuck arguing that, you know, I'm right and you're wrong. You know, clearly my money approach is the better one and yours is wrong. And what they don't take into account are the other two dimensions, because every money approach will have its pros and cons. And so if you take the typical, you know, the couple in which one is very frugal and saves a lot and is very good at kind of investing for the future, and the other one overspends, well, you know, from the outside, you could say, clear, you know, the overspender is doing everything wrong. But, you know, I guess when you start digging into it, you can see that the frugal partner is actually quite envious of the overspender because they're enjoying money, whereas the frugal partner might be feeling quite guilty every time they spend, and you know, that's why they save. And so once you start looking at, well, what is the advantage of the other money approach and what's the disadvantage of my money approach, that you actually start creating a space in which, instead of thinking, oh, we're incompatible when it comes to money, we can think of each other as maybe complementary. You know, maybe you can teach me a little bit about how to enjoy money a bit more, and I can teach you a little bit about how to be more responsible with it. And I think that's when you create a space for negotiating something.
Yeah. I like that. It's like back to that piece of balancing. And you actually said something as well around, actually, sometimes those arguments about money is not actually about money. Can you talk a little bit more around that? Because I think I really want to hit this home for people, because a lot of people say, oh, we're arguing about money. But like you said, it's actually, sometimes it's not about that.
I mean, I've heard people say, oh, he's not giving me enough money. And when we go into it, you know, the maths don't look that odd. And so is it money he's not giving you enough of? Well, actually, you know, he's never around anymore, and, you know, he hasn't been present lately. Okay, so maybe you want him to invest more in the relationship. That's what you mean. Yes, that's what I mean. And you see how, you know, sometimes it's just easier to say things in money terms because maybe it doesn't hit quite as deep and it doesn't make us feel as vulnerable as maybe saying something like, you know, I don't feel cared for enough. So, yeah, there's all sorts of different examples, but sometimes we let money do the talking.
Yeah. It is very interesting, especially the fact that, like you say, that it's in that situation where it was more about, okay, is this person present? Does this person actually care for me? Like, as if the money, them spending would make. I mean, some people think that spending money actually means you care, though, too. A lot of people think that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll give you an example with that. If you think of parents who keep kind of paying for their children and maybe rescuing them out of their kind of financial messes. On the one hand, you can look at it and say, look, you know, this parent is expressing their love through all this giving, which could be true, but what could also be happening is that the parent is saying, well, I don't really want them to become independent and leave and not need me anymore. And they kind of have become complicit in a dynamic in which they're not really enabling their child to, you know, get on with it and become financially independent and, you know, take responsibility for their mistakes, because it comes from a place within them that maybe wants to draw the child closer, doesn't want to let them go. And I think that's, you know, another example in which money is kind of expressing something about the relationship and enabling something in the relationship that it goes beyond the financial.
That's interesting. No, that is very interesting. I guess we've got to be very conscious of how we how the way we feel, how that can influence how we use money to control or whatever. We've got to be very careful of that, because people can use money to control. It is an element of, you can control people with it, if we're being honest, right?
Oh, yeah. And we're approaching the Christmas season, and it's we need to be mindful of how we give gifts and what gifts we buy, because gifts can be controlling in some way. You know, sometimes they're an expression of generosity. You know, we want the other person to feel pleased when they open the present, but sometimes they come with strings attached. And, you know, we're expecting something in return. Well, you know, now that I gave you this, I don't know, laptop for Christmas, can you help me every time I have a technology problem? You know, can you be the one I call for? Or think about, one of the examples I have in the book is the wife that keeps buying the T-shirt wearing husband a collared shirt, not because she thinks he'll like it, but because that's what she wants him to wear. And even though this poor husband kind of never wears shirts because he hates shirts, she keeps getting him shirts for Christmas. Now, isn't that a controlling gift? Because in a way, you're imposing what you want on the other, rather than coming from a place of, you know, I celebrate who you are, and I'm going to give you something that I think you'll enjoy, like another T-shirt, right? So I think there's all sorts of subtle ways in which we can be controlling without even realizing it. And then there's the extremes of financial abuse, economic abuse, and those are, you know, a whole different story, right? It can really get people stuck in very difficult situations, very hard to leave.
Yeah, maybe we can talk that in part 2, financial abuse, because that is an interesting one. And I think that's an emerging one that I'm currently getting my head around, because money is such an interesting thing, because although, like we said, it's not, is this paper metal thing? It can mean so many things for so many people. It can mean the difference between you being alive or not, because it provides food, provides shelter. So somebody's withholding that from you, that's going to create all sorts of, you know, problems. I wanted to ask you, right, in terms of, you know, opening this conversation, like with your partner, not just your partner, but let's say anybody you want to open this conversation with money. How can people, you know, open these kind of conversations with people they love?
I'm sure I'm not going to remember all the tips I have in the book, but some of them are quite basic, because and we forget this. How many people bring up money and when their partner is about to fall asleep or walk out the door, rather than have, you know, a money date, you know, set out time in which, you know, you're both not busy, and sit down and talk finances. You know, that's one of the barriers to having a good financial conversation, is that we don't recognize how anxiety provoking it can be for the other. And so we don't bring it up at a time in which the other can have that kind of calm state to be able to open up and maybe be even a bit vulnerable, because that's what it evokes for them. And then try always, you know, when you talk about money, don't try to win, try to understand the other, try to see where they're coming from. You know, I was talking to somebody who was so frustrated that their partner kept buying stationery, spending all this money on this fancy stationery all the time. She's like, it's such a waste of money. You know, why can't we save it for the holidays, something else? And actually, when they sat down to have a conversation, it turns out that he was going through a really rough patch at work. He was really demotivated. And the one thing that kind of made him look forward to go to the office was that he was getting all these new different, erasers and gadgets. And, you know, he was a creative. So spending in the materials made a bit of a difference in how he felt about going to work. And so you see how, you know, something that on the surface seems like a silly money behavior could actually have a lot of meaning for your partner if you just create a space in which you can ask, and in which you're not saying, well, you know, you're being ridiculous for spending this money, but you're actually saying, but I'm really curious, why stationery? What about it? And actually with this person, they remembered that any time when they were little, they went to a stationery shop, the mother would only buy the basic essentials and would never indulge them in something they wanted. So it was also, in part, them giving themselves a different experience from the one they had growing up, now that they could afford it. It was their way of enjoying their money. And so you see how kind of understanding all that background story helps you feel different about how you're going to look at it. So I think, non-judgment, pick the right time. Definitely don't bring it up, at a Christmas dinner in front of everybody else.
That's so embarrassing. Oh my God, yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I want to talk about this phenomenon of Christmas, right? We're all gonna enjoy it. Look, people enjoy your Christmas. I don't know if they'll hear this before Christmas or after. Either or, enjoy your Christmas. I hope you enjoy your Christmas. Christmas is an interesting time because it's when people, the closer we get to Christmas, when people are very happy to spend, and then post Christmas, everybody in January is kind of like post, ooh, let's save up, we overspent, that whole feeling, right, of, let me say, societal pressure, because it is a societal pressure. If I'm going to be honest, right, I'm not saying do not get presents for people, but there is, I think, the societal pressure to be really generous, maybe even to the detriment of yourself, and that if you're not as generous, and when I say not as generous, I mean just from a point of view of maybe where you can't afford it, right? You can't, right? Maybe you can afford, let's say you could afford something like £10 gift, and you're like, no, nobody's going to accept a £10 gift. How do you deal with that? How can you kind of manage, that happening?
Well, I think many of us have fallen trap to this idea that the only way to be generous is financially. And that's the first thing I would challenge. There's £10 gift that have so much thought and time and effort gone into them, whatever, a scrapbook or something significant, and the modern version of a mixtape, whatever it is, that can send the same message, hopefully of love, of care, and be received with the same enthusiasm as a very expensive bag that maybe meant nothing to the other person and was chosen, just on a whim. So I think expand your definition of what's generous. And then, if you see that you're really stretching your budget to meet people's expectations, take a step back and think about, well, what do I want to spend for Christmas? What can I afford to spend for Christmas? And how am I going to divide this amongst the people I care about? And, there's families that decide to do Secret Santa because that's one affordable way of making sure everybody receives something and has something to open. People join up on gift giving all the time. And other people who really can't afford to give very much at all might just, give their time in one way or another, or go for an experience together and work, let's say feed the relationship in a different way. Because let's not forget, the whole point is not to, receive financially, it's a time to be together, celebrate family, and exchange hopefully more than just money and presents.
Yeah, I think it's important, and is an important message, and is an important conversation for us to have, because I like the fact that you're saying that generosity doesn't just have to be financially. I think in a consumer heavy society, I think we do associate, okay, if we're generous, it means just buying this really expensive thing, which actually that's still nice. I'm not saying that's not nice. We're not discounting that, but it makes it, sometimes it seems so black and white that that's the only thing you can kind of contribute to it. If you do anything less than that, it means you're generous or not. So.
Somebody was asking me recently, about giving gifts to children, and how this year, with all the large family that they have, they can afford to give as much as they gave other years, and how to deal with that. And one of the things that I said to them was, if you explain, for example, that this year you can't afford to buy as many gifts as last year, and so you've decreased your budget, and this is why the gift is smaller. Now, yes, some might be disappointed, but to counterbalance that, what you've just given them is an important money lesson they're going to carry for the rest of their lives. It's going to log in their little brains that sometimes we have to make sacrifices. We have to be thoughtful when it comes to money. We have a budget in mind. Sometimes it has to be less. And you're modeling being a responsible adult and making mindful financial choices. And honestly, that's a gift. Most children don't get to hear things explained that way when it comes to money.
It's important, especially. So, I'm looking into the new year, right? And I know people watching, listening to this will be thinking about their money goals. I'm sure that people come to you probably around the January period, maybe even before, thinking about this, right? So forming these habits. I want to talk to you about, from your point of view, right? You being a psychotherapist, you being like very well trained in that. These habits that form, how are they actually formed? How are our habits and, the way we kind of, the reason why we do some things on automatic, how they form? And I'm thinking of it as well from a perspective from the money side as well.
How habits are formed. I suppose it really varies. Sometimes, we've seen our parents do it and we do it. We just repeat. And if it doesn't hurt us and it serves us, then we just keep going. Did you have one particular habit in mind?
Yeah. Okay, let me think of one, because we talked about retail therapy, which is a type of habit.
Maybe something around being too frugal. I don't know.
Yeah,
people who
let's
collect coupons.
Yeah, let's talk about that one. Yeah, that's a good one. I like that.
Yeah, I think with a lot of the money behaviors, one of the useful questions to ask yourself is this thing that I'm doing with money, is this money habit a reflection of something that is pervasive in my personality? So, for example, I am somebody who tends to withhold in all sorts of ways. I withhold emotionally. I'm not very good at giving gifts. And then, I'm also withholding with myself, with money. I don't allow myself to have, the good brand cereal. I always get, the cheapest brand, and only if I have a coupon, for example, right? Or is it something that is very specific to money? And that already kind of opens up a thinking space, because if it's something that you do in general, then maybe you need to think about that aspect of your personality more broadly. If it just comes down to money, then why might that be? Did you watch somebody collect those coupons growing up, or did it come from a time in which, you overheard your parents talk about, dad might lose his job or something like that. And that's when you started kind of becoming more careful and frugal, and it kind of stuck with you. So I think whatever the money habit, it's worth looking at the bigger picture. Is this what I do in general with all other objects, not just this symbolic object that is money? And then if it is just with money, try to unpick, when did it start? What triggered it? What was it doing for you back then when you started doing it? And is it still serving that purpose now? Does it still make sense in the context of your life? So that you can question if it's still a good habit to have, or if it's a bad habit that you want to try to move away from. Yeah.
Is there any tips that you have for people where they can think, especially if they're thinking about the new year, and let's say they want to adopt one new habit in the new year? Is there any kind of tips that you have for people to help them, kind of navigate that and be able to start forming some good ones?
Well, I would say there's a lot of tools out there these days that can help us be better with money. So whether it is you want to be better with saving, or you want to be better with budgeting, there's plenty of new apps out there that can be just incredibly helpful. Before we had to, log into an account and go online, and it was like an endless process. Now, the technology has its bad aspects, but it also has its really helpful aspects when it comes to these things. So find the right tools, do a bit of research, find the right tools to enable this new habit to develop in an easy way.
Yeah.
And then just try to be as consistent as you can for a small amount of time. I forget the exact numbers, and depending on what research you read, it's different. But there's a certain number of times that you need to do something for it to become a habit. The point is, try to force yourself to do it consistently a few times so that you give it a chance to become a consistent habit, whether it is a money date or whether it is that, you want to stop being avoidant with money and you want to start checking your account once a week. Well, fix a time every week, make it concrete, make it specific, don't be vague. I think new habits like I want to be better with money. Well, that's not a habit, that's a very vague resolution. But make it concrete, specific, and stick to it.
Okay. Amazing. So I want to talk a bit about your book, right? Money on Your Mind. So this is the book, if people can see it in the camera. So what can people kind of expect from the book, if you just want to give us a bit of an overview?
So the book goes through different money behaviors, overspending, underspending, greed, money secrets, financial control. And then it has some chapters in the end around money and relationships. So relationships with your siblings, with your family, work relationships, friendships and money, and couples and money. And in the end, there's a chapter on how to change your attitude to money. And within each chapter, I talk about, what kind of deep emotional reasons could be driving these behaviors. What could be behind your excessive greed? What could be behind your excessive generosity? And I use case studies from my practice, obviously anonymized, but also, famous people out there and examples from books and movies and so on to help bring it all to life and make it relevant. But the feedback I had from people is, they recognize themselves in different chapters of the book and hopefully have aha moments in which they see, what could be behind something that they're doing.
I think it's important, especially to think of it from a behavior perspective. I don't think we have much. Actually, not much. I don't think we have, aside from your book, any literature that talks about money from a psychology point of view. And I think that's very, very important because, as we've discussed today, a lot of it is rooted in our behaviors. It's not just a black and white thing where it's, okay, I just use money just because, not because of my feelings or my attitudes or the way I, the thought that I've had of the day, right? It is actually linked to that. So I think it's important to have more of that conversation. I don't think we have that enough. I think sometimes we tend to think of it very in a binary kind of way. It just happens.
Yeah. I think, there's only few books on the topic that are written for people who aren't therapists and, for the general public. And I guess ultimately I wanted to give people an experience of feeling a bit calmer when it comes to money, feeling a bit happier because it's something has been understood. They've understood something about themselves and their relationship with money that maybe had been sitting in the background before. And it's interesting because when you start pulling the thread, the money thread, it can take you into quite, deep places within you, and you might understand something about yourself that you didn't know.
Amazing. So you, as working as a psychotherapist, can you talk to us a little bit about how you work with people? Yeah, how you work with people.
Yeah. So people come to the therapy room and I ask them, what brings you here? And we go from there. it's, as I was saying a minute ago, it's about pulling that thread and seeing where it takes you. And obviously, as a psychotherapist, I try to listen for kind of clues into their unconscious thoughts and feelings so that we can get into, well, places that weren't so visible and thoughts and feelings that they weren't so aware of before. So, and I do that by, asking a lot of questions.
Is there any like areas that you work on, or is it holistically you work on no matter what somebody comes to you? I'm like, yeah, I'm here to kind of help you.
There's very few things I wouldn't work with, but as a therapist, any emotional difficulty that somebody has, we'll talk about. And we always have a couple of initial consultations to figure out if this kind of therapy would be helpful to you, either because of maybe the way you think or the kind of issue that you have. Some people come and expect really kind of practical tips and advice. And actually, the people I help are the people who know what the tips and advice, they know what they should be doing with money, but a part of them can bring themselves to do it. And I'm there to help them explore the feelings more than to give them the answers.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you, if they want to reach out to you?
2 places, LinkedIn and Instagram. So Vicky Reynal Psychotherapy on Instagram, and my name on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Vicky, so much. Thank you so much. Like I've learned a lot, and it's been such an interesting conversation because I think, like I said, it gets us to think about, I'm quite comfortable with money. I mean, my whole podcast is about it, but I think it's very important for people to understand that, we do have a certain behavior with money, to understand, and that can happen in so many situations, but people don't realize that. So I think it was a very important conversation to have, and thank you so much for talking through some of the themes in your book. It's really, really important, especially as a time where I think that in this current society that we have, right? We're now coming through Christmas. We've got so many, how do I say it? In terms of the ease of spending money, maybe even investing, gambling, I think it's becoming even more easier with the apps that we have. Like even the cars is all contactless now. Shopping is online, right? Like before shopping online, you had to physically go to the store, and now everything's made much easier for us. So I think it's important for us to be conscious of these things. I guess what I'm saying is the barriers have been reduced, and I think when barriers are reduced, it means that it invites like you being a bit more excessive. So yeah, really appreciate you talking us through all these subjects. Do you have any final words for the watchers and listeners?
Well, just have a think about what money means to you. What do you let it stand for in your life? Be more thoughtful about it. And I wanted to thank you for all your interesting questions and for allowing me to use you a bit as a case study.
Yeah.
Part of it.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you so much, Vicky. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of podcast. See you next week's episode.